With 60 minutes left before the only flight that could get him to his mother's funeral, Marcus Whitfield was blocked at the gate when a wealthy executive named Diana Sinclair demanded his seat and offered to pay whatever it cost. He turned her down. This was his one chance to say goodbye. The dispute grew until the shift supervisor and everyone he answered to sided with the powerful woman and voided Marcus's ticket. Marcus never raised his voice. Instead, he walked to the service counter and asked them to confirm who legally owned the airline. Moments later, the terminal fell completely silent. The house at the edge of Omaha sat behind a gravel driveway with a mailbox that tilted slightly to one side, and Marcus Whitfield had never bothered to fix either one. He drove a sedan nearly a decade old. Every morning, he bought coffee from the same gas station on Dodge Street, and the clerk there was convinced he worked in insurance. He'd never bothered to set her straight. At 42, Marcus had constructed a life so plain that people forgot they'd met him within the hour, and that was exactly the point. His neighbors knew 3 things about him. He raised his kid alone. He worked from home doing something with airlines, data crunching, route analysis, delay patterns, the kind of job that sounded impressive until a second question revealed nobody actually understood what it meant. Marcus let that impression sit. When people asked what he did, he told them he studied flight data, and that was technically true. What nobody around him knew was that 11 years ago, in a cramped office above a tire shop, Marcus had signed the paperwork that created a company called Meridian Aviation Group. Back then, it owned nothing but a lease on 2 turboprops and a mountain of debt he couldn't discuss without his voice cracking. Now it controlled 4 regional airlines, a ground services operation spanning more than 60 airports, a maintenance network, and a majority stake in a fuel logistics company that supplied half the Midwest. He'd structured the ownership so his name showed up in exactly one place on any registry, tucked beneath a holding company and a trust. No website carried his photo. He'd never sat for an interview. The board recognized him. His chief of staff, Ethan Cross, recognized him. Everyone else in the company just understood there was a founder out there somewhere who preferred staying a rumor. There was a reason he rarely spoke about. He'd watched what happened to men who flaunted their wealth, how it changed the way people addressed them and the way they addressed people back. Early on, he'd decided he wanted to know how the world treated someone who looked like nobody at all. It was, he told himself, the only honest way to evaluate a company from the inside out. His mother had been the one person who knew the whole story from day one. Eleanor Whitfield had been widowed for 26 years. She'd raised Marcus by herself in a rented duplex in Charleston, South Carolina, working the front desk of a hotel that no longer existed, and she'd never once suggested his ambitions were too big. When his first 2 turboprops sat grounded for 4 months and he couldn't cover payroll, she wired him $11,000 without asking when she'd see it again. It was every cent she owned. He paid it back 40 times over, and she never brought it up again. She called every Sunday. She'd ask about the weather in Nebraska, whether he was sleeping enough. She never once asked about revenue, the board, or acquisitions. She understood something about her son that no analyst ever had. The company wasn't the real accomplishment. The accomplishment was that he'd remained the same person underneath it. Their last Sunday call had been unremarkable. She mentioned a leak in the kitchen ceiling, a neighbor's dog that barked at nothing. He told her he'd visit that fall. She said fall was a long way off. He said he knew. He was reviewing a route performance file on a Tuesday afternoon when his phone rang, a cousin he spoke to maybe twice a year. The stroke had hit that morning, fast, in the kitchen. Paramedics reached her within 9 minutes. None of it mattered. Marcus listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, then asked when the service would be held. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, at the church on Ashley Avenue she attended every week for 30 years. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at the wall without seeing anything. Then he opened his laptop, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with grief. The storm system was already on the radar. It had come off the Atlantic and stalled over the Carolinas, and the forecast models showed the coastal corridor collapsing late Wednesday night, with Charleston dropping below landing minimums by 2 or 3 in the morning, closed for most of Thursday, possibly bleeding into Friday. There was exactly one window, Wednesday evening, and it was narrow. His own aircraft were useless to him. Meridian ran a small executive fleet, and every plane was either committed elsewhere or positioned east of the storm system. The two that could theoretically reroute to Omaha wouldn't arrive in time to beat the coastal restrictions. Marcus ran the numbers twice. He owned an aviation empire, and the physics of weather didn't care. Ethan Cross called 20 minutes later, having heard through the family group chain, and offered to make arrangements. He used the word arrangements the way a man does when he means he'll move heaven and earth. Marcus told him no. He said he'd book a commercial seat like anybody else. When Cross started to push back, Marcus said something Cross would repeat for years afterwards. "I find it rather honest," said Marcus, "a fair test of what we built. If I can't get to my mother's funeral on the system I built, then the system's broken, and I'd rather find that out now." One seat remained on the only itinerary that worked. Skyline Airways out of Omaha Wednesday evening, one connection in Atlanta, landing in Charleston at 11:35 p.m. Eastern, giving him 10 hours of cushion before the service. Skyline was a Meridian subsidiary. Marcus booked the last seat under his real name, 27C, and paid $418 on a personal card. He packed a black suit, a white shirt, and a tie he'd bought for his mother's 70th birthday. He arrived at the airport by 4 Wednesday afternoon. The terminal buzzed with the particular chaos of an evening when weather starts eating into schedules elsewhere. Departure boards showed scattered yellow warnings. Marcus stood in the security line in a gray jacket and worn boots, carrying a single bag, and no one gave him a second glance. At gate 14, he sat 6 seats down from the counter without pulling out his laptop. He watched the ground crew work the aircraft. He watched a fuel line disconnect. With 60 minutes left before the only flight that could get him to his mother's funeral, Marcus Whitfield was blocked at the gate when a wealthy executive named Diana Sinclair demanded his seat and offered to pay whatever it cost. He turned her down. This was his one chance to say goodbye. The dispute grew until the shift supervisor and everyone he answered to sided with the powerful woman and voided Marcus's ticket. Marcus never raised his voice. Instead, he walked to the service counter and asked them to confirm who legally owned the airline. Moments later, the terminal fell completely silent. The house at the edge of Omaha sat behind a gravel driveway with a mailbox that tilted slightly to one side, and Marcus Whitfield had never bothered to fix either one. He drove a sedan nearly a decade old. Every morning he bought coffee from the same gas station on Dodge Street, and the clerk there was convinced he worked in insurance. He'd never bothered to set her straight. At 42, Marcus had constructed a life so plain that people forgot they'd met him within the hour, and that was exactly the point. His neighbors knew 3 things about him. He raised his kid alone. He worked from home doing something with airlines, data crunching, route analysis, delay patterns, the kind of job that sounded impressive until a second question revealed nobody actually understood what it meant. Marcus let that impression sit. When people asked what he did, he told them he studied flight data, and that was technically true. What nobody around him knew was that 11 years ago, in a cramped office above a tire shop, Marcus had signed the paperwork that created a company called Meridian Aviation Group. Back then, it owned nothing but a lease on 2 turboprops and a mountain of debt he couldn't discuss without his voice cracking. Now it controlled 4 regional airlines, a ground services operation spanning more than 60 airports, a maintenance network, and a majority stake in a fuel logistics company that supplied half the Midwest. He'd structured the ownership so his name showed up in exactly one place on any registry, tucked beneath a holding company and a trust. No website carried his photo. He'd never sat for an interview. The board recognized him. His chief of staff, Ethan Cross, recognized him. Everyone else in the company just understood there was a founder out there somewhere who preferred staying a rumor. There was a reason he rarely spoke about. He'd watched what happened to men who flaunted their wealth, how it changed the way people addressed them and the way they addressed people back. Early on, he'd decided he wanted to know how the world treated someone who looked like nobody at all. It was, he told himself, the only honest way to evaluate a company from the inside out. His mother had been the one person who knew the whole story from day one. Eleanor Whitfield had been widowed for 26 years. She'd raised Marcus by herself in a rented duplex in Charleston, South Carolina, working the front desk of a hotel that no longer existed, and she'd never once suggested his ambitions were too big. When his first 2 turboprops sat grounded for 4 months and he couldn't cover payroll, she wired him $11,000 without asking when she'd see it again. It was every cent she owned. He paid it back 40 times over, and she never brought it up again. She called every Sunday. She'd ask about the weather in Nebraska, whether he was sleeping enough. She never once asked about revenue, the board, or acquisitions. She understood something about her son that no analyst ever had. The company wasn't the real accomplishment. The accomplishment was that he'd remained the same person underneath it. Their last Sunday call had been unremarkable. She mentioned a leak in the kitchen ceiling, a neighbor's dog that barked at nothing. He told her he'd visit that fall. She said fall was a long way off. He said he knew. He was reviewing a route performance file on a Tuesday afternoon when his phone rang, a cousin he spoke to maybe twice a year. The stroke had hit that morning, fast, in the kitchen. Paramedics reached her within 9 minutes. None of it mattered. Marcus listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, then asked when the service would be held. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, at the church on Ashley Avenue she attended every week for 30 years. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at the wall without seeing anything. Then he opened his laptop, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with grief. The storm system was already on the radar. It had come off the Atlantic and stalled over the Carolinas, and the forecast models showed the coastal corridor collapsing late Wednesday night, with Charleston dropping below landing minimums by 2 or 3 in the morning, closed for most of Thursday, possibly bleeding into Friday. There was exactly one window, Wednesday evening, and it was narrow. His own aircraft were useless to him. Meridian ran a small executive fleet, and every plane was either committed elsewhere or positioned east of the storm system. The 2 that could theoretically reroute to Omaha wouldn't arrive in time to beat the coastal restrictions. Marcus ran the numbers twice. He owned an aviation empire, and the physics of weather didn't care. Ethan Cross called 20 minutes later, having heard through the family group chain, and offered to make arrangements. He used the word arrangements the way a man does when he means he'll move heaven and earth. Marcus told him no. He said he'd book a commercial seat like anybody else. When Cross started to push back, Marcus said something Cross would repeat for years afterwards. "I find it rather honest," said Marcus, "a fair test of what we built. If I can't get to my mother's funeral on the system I built, then the system's broken, and I'd rather find that out now." One seat remained on the only itinerary that worked. Skyline Airways out of Omaha Wednesday evening, one connection in Atlanta, landing in Charleston at 11:35 p.m. Eastern, giving him 10 hours of cushion before the service. Skyline was a Meridian subsidiary. Marcus booked the last seat under his real name, 27C, and paid $418 on a personal card. He packed a black suit, a white shirt, and a tie he'd bought for his mother's 70th birthday. He arrived at the airport by 4 Wednesday afternoon. The terminal buzzed with the particular chaos of an evening when weather starts eating into schedules elsewhere. Departure boards showed scattered yellow warnings. Marcus stood in the security line in a gray jacket and worn boots, carrying a single bag, and no one gave him a second glance. At gate 14, he sat 6 seats down from the counter without pulling out his laptop. He watched the ground crew work the aircraft. He watched a fuel line disconnect. 11 years he'd read these movements as data. Now he watched them as a man about to bury his mother and found they meant absolutely nothing. Flight 290 was set to leave at 6:55. The gate would close at 6:40. Diana Sinclair showed up at 6:05 with 3 people trailing behind her. Marcus noticed her before she even reached the counter. Everyone did. She was in her early 40s, wearing a charcoal coat tailored specifically to her, and she moved through the concourse without adjusting her path for anyone. The 3 behind her carried bags. One muttered into a phone, repeating something twice. She went straight to the gate agent, a young woman with dark hair pulled back, badge reading Sarah Mitchell, and skipped any greeting. "I have 3 seats in row 27 and 4 people," Diana said. "I need a 4th. Sarah checked her screen and explained Flight 290 had sold out the previous afternoon. There wasn't an open seat anywhere on the plane, and the 4th traveler was currently on standby, unassigned. "Then find one," Diana said. Sarah explained the only option was announcing over the PA whether any passenger would voluntarily give up a confirmed seat for compensation and rebooking. She could ask, but she couldn't force it. Diana told her to ask. The announcement went out at 6:05. 1 volunteer, hotel and credit included. Nobody moved. Marcus understood why. Everyone at that gate was racing the same closing sky, and none of them had a backup plan either. Diana turned and scanned the waiting area, her eyes sweeping across faces like she was reading a price sheet. She spoke to her assistant, who returned moments later from the counter with a printed page. She studied it, then looked directly at Marcus. She crossed over and sat in the empty seat beside him, uninvited. "You're 27C, she said. Marcus confirmed it. "My row is 27A, B, and D. You're the hole in the middle. I have 4 people and 3 hours in the air to finish a presentation that decides whether my firm survives the quarter, and I can't do that with a partner sitting 11 rows away. Name a price." He told her the seat wasn't for sale. "Everything's for sale," she said. $2,000. Marcus kept his eyes on the window and told her he was flying to his mother's funeral, that the service was 10 o'clock Thursday morning in Charleston, and this was the last flight that could reach the ground before it dropped below minimums. He said it plainly, like a man stating a fact he'd already made peace with, without raising his voice. Something crossed Diana's face, there for less than a second, then gone, replaced by the look of someone who'd decided an obstacle was just a negotiation. $5,000, she said. $5,000 and I'll have my office put you on the first flight tomorrow morning, first class, car waiting. He told her there wouldn't be a flight tomorrow morning. He told her the field would drop below landing minimums by roughly 3 a.m., stay that way most of Thursday and possibly into Friday, and that he'd run the models himself. The rebooking she was describing simply didn't exist. Then take the money and take the risk. That's what everyone else does. Marcus turned and looked directly at her once, quietly, and turned back to the window. Diana stood. She said nothing more to him. She walked back to the counter, set her phone face up on the surface between herself and Sarah Mitchell, and asked for the name of the station manager on duty. The following 14 minutes were the part Marcus would remember most vividly afterward, and not for any shouting, because there was none. Diana made 2 calls. The first went to a man whose name she wielded like a key, someone in Skyline's commercial division who owed her firm something or wanted something from it. The second call was shorter. Then a man in a blue blazer came striding up from the operations door, mid-50s, badge reading Gordon Reese, shift manager. Reese spoke to Diana first. He listened, nodded twice, said absolutely, and of course, then went behind the counter and started typing. Sarah Mitchell said something he couldn't hear. Reese answered without looking up. Sarah said something else, and this time he caught the tail end of it, that the passenger hadn't consented and the seat was confirmed. "It's under review," Reese said. "That's not the same as confirmed." What followed was procedure weaponized, and Marcus recognized every step because he personally signed off on the policy document that made each one possible. Reese called him to the counter and told him there was an irregularity on his booking. He said the payment method needed secondary verification. He said a one-way itinerary purchased close to departure by a solo passenger with a single carry-on matched a screening profile, and under the carrier's conditions of carriage, the airline reserved the right to deny transport pending review. Marcus told him that code exists to catch stolen cards, and nothing about his reservation had triggered anything until 14 minutes ago. "That's not for me to discuss," Reese said. Marcus asked how long the review would take. "As long as it takes." Marcus asked whether the review had opened before the woman in the charcoal coat had approached him. Reese said he wouldn't discuss other passengers. Boarding began. Reese kept typing. Sarah Mitchell stood at the scanner processing passengers, jaw tight, glancing at Marcus twice and looking away both times. At 9 minutes past 6, Reese told Marcus his reservation had concluded, his refund would process in 7 to 10 business days, and he was welcome to rebook subject to availability. Diana's assistant was already at the scanner with 4 boarding passes. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't tell Reese who he was. Later, when people asked why, he'd say that a man who has to announce his power to actually have it.
Hold it, doesn't really have any. He looked at the clock, then at the jet bridge door, and understood exactly where he stood. He'd spent 11 years building a company on the idea that a passenger with zero leverage deserved to be treated like a passenger anyway. He'd written that principle himself at a folding table above a tire shop, saying it out loud over the phone to his mother while she was still alive to hear it. And now, 46 minutes before the last flight that could carry him to her grave, a shift manager was canceling his ticket to make room for a woman who'd offered him $5,000. 2 options remained, and both would cost him something. Accept it, walk to the parking garage and miss the only funeral he'd ever get to attend, or say the thing he hadn't said out loud to a stranger in 11 years and surrender the anonymity that had let him see his own company clearly. Marcus picked up his bag. He stopped at the end of the counter where Sarah Mitchell was scanning passes and spoke quietly enough that Reese didn't catch it. "There's a compliance tab in the corporate directory. Under it, an ownership registry. I'm asking you to open it and look up the controlling owner of Skyline Airways, the parent entity, and the person behind the trust. 2 clicks, that's the whole ask." Sarah looked at him. She didn't answer. Marcus walked down the concourse to the Skyline customer service desk at the center of the terminal, where a supervisor stood behind the counter with a headset around her neck. He set his bag down and put both hands flat on the surface. "I need you to run a verification, not on my ticket, on the ownership registry." She asked what he meant. "Skyline Airways," Marcus said. "Who legally owns it? You have access to that record. Takes about 90 seconds. She looked at the gray jacket, the worn boots, the single bag, and didn't move. "Please," Marcus said, "run it." The supervisor's name was Denise Carlton, and she'd worked the Omaha customer service desk for 6 years. She didn't run the verification. She told Marcus ownership records weren't something she could pull at a service counter, which wasn't true, and that he needed to take his complaint back to the gate, which was where the complaint had started. Marcus told her the record was 2 clicks away and he'd wait. Denise looked past him toward the concourse instead at her screen. Behind him, the story had already traveled, the way things travel through an airport, from the scanner to the jet bridge to the operations door and back again. By 6:18, people were watching. Diana Sinclair hadn't boarded. She stood 20 feet back, coat over her arm, watching Marcus the way someone watches a car alarm that won't shut off. Gordon Reese came down the concourse with a printed page in hand. He didn't address Marcus at first. He told Denise the reservation had been canceled following review. The matter was closed, and if the passenger kept making demands at multiple service points, it would be logged as a disruption. Marcus asked him again to run the ownership record. "I know what you're doing," Reese said. "You'll keep asking for something nobody at this desk can give you. You'll run the clock, then tell me the flight left without you and it's our fault. I've done this 21 years. It's the oldest move there is." Diana's voice came from behind them, unhurried. She said the gentleman had already turned down $5,000, and in her experience, a man who refuses $5,000 isn't after money, he's after an audience. A few people near the counter laughed, not unkindly, not loudly, which somehow made it worse. Marcus didn't turn around. He kept both hands flat on the counter and asked Denise Carlton once more to pull up the controlling ownership entry for Skyline Airways and the person listed behind the parent trust. Denise typed something. Whether it was the query or a note in his passenger file, Marcus couldn't tell. The clock above the desk read 6:22. The gate would close at 6:40. Everything he'd built, every escalation path he'd personally approved, and none of it could move fast enough to get him onto a plane sitting 300 feet away with its door still open. He thought about calling Ethan Cross. One call, 40 seconds, and a man in Denver would start making calls that ended with Gordon Reese standing in a hallway explaining himself. He pulled his phone, looked at it, and didn't dial. It wasn't pride that stopped him. It was the realization that if he had to reach outside the building to be treated fairly inside it, he already had his answer about the company, and it was the worst possible one. So he set the phone face down on the counter and told Denise he wasn't leaving until someone ran the search. Reese said security would be called. "Call them," Marcus said. What he didn't know was that the verification had already run. Sarah Mitchell had pulled it at 6:18 from the gate terminal while she was supposed to be closing out the boarding manifest. She'd done it because a passenger had stood at the end of her counter and named the exact tab in the exact internal language, and in 14 months on the job, she'd never once heard a passenger speak that way. The record opened in a plain gray window, unformatted the way internal records do. Skyline Airways, wholly owned subsidiary, parent entity, Meridian Aviation Group, controlling interest held through the Whitfield Family Trust, beneficial owner and founder, natural person, Marcus D. Whitfield, date of birth, redacted, residential address, Omaha, Nebraska. Beneath it, a compliance flag. The individual's travel was not to be disclosed to station personnel without written authorization. Sarah read it 3 times. Then she looked at the canceled reservation still open in the adjacent window, seat 27C, passenger Whitfield, Marcus D., and felt the floor of her working life tilt. She didn't shout it across the terminal. She did what she'd been trained to do, escalate a compliance flag. The system gave her exactly 2 addresses for that category, the corporate compliance mailbox and the station director's line. She sent it to both.
At 6:19, the station director's phone rang on the terminal's second level. Walter Simmons had been finishing a delay report. He listened for 9 seconds, said, "Say that again," listened for another 20, and then he was moving. At 6:21, the compliance mailbox auto-forwarded to the executive duty line. In Denver, in a glass conference room where a quarterly review had run 2 hours already, Diane Foster's phone lit up on the table in front of her. Foster had served as Skyline's chief executive for 3 years. She'd met Marcus Whitfield exactly 4 times, always in rooms with fewer than 6 people, and had signed a non-disclosure covering his existence before she'd signed her own employment contract. She read the alert, stood mid-sentence while someone else was talking, and walked out with the phone against her ear. Down on the main concourse, a uniformed officer asked Marcus for identification. He produced his Nebraska driver's license, gray jacket, a photo where he looked exactly as tired as he looked in person. The officer read the name, handed it back, and told him, not unkindly, that he needed to either accept the rebooking or step away from the counter. "I understand," Marcus said, and didn't move. Diana stepped closer, still holding her coat, wearing the look of someone who's won something and is discovering the win doesn't feel the way she expected. "You could have taken the money," she said. "You still can. 10,000. I'll write it right now and keep whatever refund they give you. Drive tomorrow if you have to." Marcus asked whether she'd ever driven from Omaha to Charleston. She said no. 22 hours, he said. The service is 10 a.m. It's 6:24 at night. She started to answer and didn't finish because at that moment there was movement at the far end of the concourse. Walter Simmons came through the operations door at a pace station directors don't use in public areas, lanyard swinging, tablet in hand. 2 operations supervisors followed, and behind them, still fixing a badge into place, the duty manager for the entire terminal. Simmons walked straight past Reese, past Diana, past the officer, and stopped in front of Marcus Whitfield, pausing a moment the way a man does when confirming with his own eyes something he's already been told. "Mr. Whitfield," Simmons said. Everyone within 30 feet heard how he said it. Marcus told him he had a canceled reservation on Flight 290, Seat 27C, and had been told the fare was under review. Simmons turned. He looked at Gordon Reese, then at the printed page in Reese's hand, then at Denise Carlton behind the counter, and something crossed his face worse than anger. "Reinstate it, now," Simmons did. Denise typed. From where he stood, Marcus watched the reservation flip back to confirmed in under 4 seconds, roughly how long the whole process should have taken from the start. Reese asked what was happening. Nobody answered. In the silence, Simmons' tablet chimed. He handed it to Reese without a word. Marcus watched the shift manager read it, watched his eyes drop down the plain gray record, stop, jump back to the top, start over, watched the color drain from Gordon Reese the specific way it drains from someone realizing the last 20 minutes of his life just reversed on him. The terminal didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a ring, spreading outward from the counter as the people nearest passed the news back to those behind them. Diana Sinclair heard it from her own assistant, who'd stood close enough to read over Reese's shoulder and leaned in to say 4 words. Diana's expression didn't change right away. She turned and looked at Marcus, the gray jacket, the single bag on the floor, the man she'd offered $10,000 to 5 minutes ago. "You own it," she said. Marcus told her he owned the parent company, that Skyline was one of 4 carriers under it, and that he'd been sitting at Gate 14 for 2 hours because he needed to get to Charleston. Simmons' phone rang. He answered, yes, twice, and held it out. Diane Foster's voice came through clearly enough for the nearest bystanders to hear. She apologized. She said she was already on the line with the Duty Operations Center, that the aircraft wouldn't push back without him, and that she was opening an immediate review of the station, and she needed to know what she wanted done with the people involved. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said the thing nobody in that concourse expected. "Nothing," he said. "Not tonight." No one was to be suspended, escorted out, or spoken to on the floor. The woman in the charcoal coat and her 3 colleagues were to board as ticketed, in the seats they'd purchased, and if anyone tried removing them from the aircraft, he'd treat it as a direct violation of his instructions. The only thing he wanted from Skyline Airways in the next 90 seconds was what any passenger with a confirmed reservation wanted, to be let onto the plane. Simmons started to say that wasn't adequate. "It's what I'm asking for," Marcus said. "My mother is being buried at 10 a.m. tomorrow. That's the entire problem. Everything else is a memo, and memos can wait until Monday." He picked up his bag and walked to Gate 14, and the crowd parted for him. Sarah Mitchell stood at the scanner with his boarding pass already printed. She'd printed it 6 minutes before anyone told her to. She handed it to her and said she was sorry. Marcus told her she was the only person in the building who had actually done her job, and he'd remember it. Then he walked down the jet bridge. He was in seat 27C by 6:38. Diana Sinclair took 27A, 2 colleagues took B and D, and the 4th stood by until the last moment, getting seated 11 rows forward when a connecting passenger failed to show. Nobody in that row said a word to anyone. The aircraft pushed back at 7:07, 12 minutes late. They'd been at cruise for an hour and 40 minutes when the captain's voice came over the cabin. The system off the Carolinas hadn't behaved the way the models predicted. Instead of holding until early morning, it had accelerated northwest and thickened, and the coastal corridor was collapsing 5 hours ahead of forecast. Charleston had dropped to 0 visibility with embedded convection and stopped accepting arrivals at 9:40 p.m. Eastern.
Marcus had his phone out the second the wheels touched down in Atlanta at 10:10. Every remaining option died in front of him over the next 40 minutes, one line at a time. The last Charleston departure, canceled. The Savannah alternate, canceled. Columbia, canceled. Charlotte was still accepting arrivals, but the Interstate South had closed at 2 points from standing water, and a normally 3-hour drive had become a distance no vehicle would cover before 10 in the morning. Ethan Cross reached him in the concourse at 11, and by then he had a plan, because that was what Cross did. He said a Challenger had come off a charter into Nashville 40 minutes earlier, sitting there with a fresh airframe and no assignment, close enough to reposition to Atlanta within 90 minutes. He said the jet could fly an approach a scheduled aircraft wouldn't attempt, that the field was technically open under instrument minimums for parts of the night, and 2 standby crews would take the assignment if the company's owner asked them to. Marcus asked what the actual conditions were at the field. Cross read them out. Ceiling below approach minimums, wind shear reported by 2 aircraft, a convective cell tracking straight across the final approach path with no committable clearance time. It's marginal, Cross said, not impossible. Crews fly marginal. Marcus asked whether the crew would be volunteering or being assigned. Silence answered before Cross did. They'd know who was asking, Cross said. That's not the same as being ordered. It's exactly the same, Marcus said. Diana Sinclair had been standing 8 feet away for most of that call. Her 3 colleagues had caught a Miami connection at 9:40, and she hadn't gone with them. Marcus noticed her when he lowered the phone, too drained to ask why she'd stayed. She asked what he planned to do. He told her his people wanted to send a crew into weather below minimums so a man could make it to a funeral, and he was going to tell them no. You could order it, she said. You have the authority. Nobody in that company would stop you. That's exactly why I can't, Marcus said. She looked at him a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted in a way that seemed to surprise even her. 6 hours ago, I told a shift manager to take a seat away from you. He did it in 14 minutes. I never once asked myself whether he could. I only asked whether he would. Marcus told her that was the difference. Authority wasn't the ability to make people do things, because almost anyone with enough money could do that. Authority was knowing which things you'd never asked for. He'd spent 11 years building a company on that second definition and watched it collapse in 20 minutes at a gate in Omaha. Then he called Cross back and, on a recorded line, formally instructed him no Meridian aircraft would be dispatched into Charleston that night, no crew was to be approached in any capacity, and the standby assignment would be canceled in writing. Cross asked if he was sure. Marcus said he was, and ended the call. He sat down in a plastic chair in a nearly empty Atlanta concourse at 12:20 in the morning, a black suit folded in the bag at his feet, 9 hours between him and a church on Ashley Avenue he wasn't going to reach. He sat there for the rest of the night, and for the most of it he didn't think about the company at all.
He thought about a duplex in Charleston with a kitchen that flooded whenever it rained hard, and a woman who came home from a hotel front desk at 11 at night and cooked a second dinner because she hadn't eaten at work. He thought about $11,000 wired without a single question. He thought about the last Sunday call, a leak in a ceiling, a dog barking at nothing, and the fact that he'd told her fall was still coming and had believed it. Diana Sinclair came back at 1:10 with 2 coffees from the only open counter and set one on the seat beside him without asking if he wanted it. She didn't say anything for a while. When she finally spoke, she told her her firm's presentation had gone ahead in Miami without her. Her partners had handled it fine, and she'd spent 3 hours realizing that the meeting she was willing to take a seat away from a grieving man for hadn't required her presence at all. Marcus told her most of them don't. At 6 a.m. his phone rang, Ethan Cross, voice different this time. The storm cell had shifted. Not cleared, but shifted, tracking northeast faster than the overnight model had shown, and the tail of the system had pulled a gap open behind it. Charleston had come back above minimums at 5:15. 2 aircraft had already landed since then. The gap was projected to hold until roughly 10:50 a.m., after which the trailing moisture would close the field for the rest of the day. Cross said he'd done exactly as instructed. The cancellation notice had gone out on the crew scheduling system in writing at 12:50 a.m., and he'd approached nobody. But a captain in Nashville named Robert Hale had read it, pulled the current conditions himself, and called the duty desk at 6:20, asking why an assignment had been canceled on a morning when the field was legal. "He wants to talk to you," Cross said. Hale came on the line and didn't waste time. 22,000 flight hours, more Charleston approaches than he could count. He'd pulled the terminal forecast, the airfield observations, the pilot reports, and the radar himself, and in his own assessment, the approach sat within limits with margin for the next 4 hours. Marcus asked if he knew who'd canceled the assignment. "I do," Hale said, "and I know why. That's why I called." He said he had a first officer, Nina Castillo, who'd reviewed the same data independently and reached the same conclusion, that neither of them had been asked, ordered, or pressured, and that if either one didn't like what they saw at any point on approach, they'd go around and divert to Charlotte, and the company's owner could sit in back and watch them do exactly that. "Those are the terms," Hale said. "If you can't take them, we don't go." Marcus asked him to state on the recorded line that this was his own decision. He said it. Castillo said it after him. Then Marcus asked one more question. Why? "I buried my father in 2009, Hale said. "I was in a hotel in Phoenix when it happened, and the airline I worked for then wouldn't move a seat for me. I've had 17 years to think about what I'd do if I ever got the chance to stand on the other side of that." Marcus rescinded his own order on the same recorded line at 6:35. He rescinded it in specific language. The dispatch was authorized solely on the captain's assessment and the captain's authority. The owner held no operational role in the flight, and a decision to divert or refuse at any point would be final and carry no consequences of any kind. The Challenger repositioned from Nashville and touched down in Atlanta at 8:20.
While that was happening, 600 miles away, the other half of the plan was unfolding. Marcus had called his cousin at 6:50, expecting to leave a message, and the phone was picked up on the second ring because nobody in that family had slept. He explained where he was, the window, the repositioning, the block time, and the drive from the field. He said the best case landed him at the cemetery somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes past 11, and he wanted them to go ahead without him if it came to that. James Coleman, pastor of the church on Ashley Avenue for 19 years, who'd known Eleanor Whitfield the whole time, called Marcus back 40 minutes later. The family had agreed. The congregation had been told.
The service would begin at 10 as scheduled. The graveside committal, normally held 40 minutes after, would be pushed to 11, and if Marcus was close, they'd hold a few extra minutes. He said Eleanor had sat in the fourth row on the left every Sunday for 30 years, had talked about her son more than anything else in her life, and that the church could manage to stand at a graveside a little longer for the one person she'd have wanted there most. Marcus thanked him and couldn't manage anything else. They took off at 9:18. Diana Sinclair didn't come. She'd asked at the ramp door if there was anything she could do, and Marcus told her there was, just not today and not for him. She asked what he meant. He said he'd tell her when it was over. Then he walked out onto the tarmac. The approach into Charleston wasn't smooth. The aircraft dropped through layers that shifted and dropped again, and twice it took a hit hard enough that Marcus pressed a hand flat against the cabin wall. He watched the altimeter on the bulkhead display and ran the same arithmetic he'd run 10,000 times as an analyst and never once as a passenger with something at stake. At 500 feet, the runway lights broke through the haze exactly where they were supposed to be. Wheels down at 10:31, 19 minutes before the window closed. A car was waiting. Cross had arranged it. Marcus changed in the back seat during the 26-minute drive, the black suit, the white shirt, and the tie he'd bought her for her 70th birthday. The driver never said a word. The church on Ashley Avenue was white, with a short flight of steps and a bell tower that had never actually held a bell. He passed it without stopping. The service had already ended, the cars already moved. He came up the cemetery path at 11:09, and James Coleman spotted him first, lifted a hand, and brought everything to a stop where it stood. The family turned. Roughly 60 people, most of them older, most connected to a hotel that no longer existed and a church that still did. They made room for him at the front without anyone needing to ask. The casket was still above ground. Coleman asked if he wanted to say anything. Marcus said no, then changed his mind. He said his mother had given him $11,000 when it was every cent she had and never asked for it back, never brought it up again. He said everything he'd built traced back to that money, and he'd never found a way to tell her what it had become, and had spent the last 2 days realizing he'd been trying to tell her the wrong thing all along. What he should have said was that she'd been right about him before there was any proof, and he'd spent every day since trying to earn it. Then he stepped back and let them lower her into the ground. It ended at 11:26. The rain started again 8 minutes later. What followed took 4 months. Marcus returned to Omaha the following Tuesday, and by Wednesday had opened a formal review of VIP handling and discretionary override procedures across all 4 Meridian carriers. He didn't run it himself. He brought in an outside firm, gave them unrestricted access, and instructed them in writing that no finding was to be softened because of who'd commissioned it. What came back was worse than the night in Omaha. The auditors found 386 instances across 26 months where a confirmed passenger's reservation had been canceled, downgraded, or placed under review within 30 minutes of a request from a passenger flagged as high value. 90 of those cases involved a code built for fraud screening, used in practice to reclaim seats. 17 involved passengers traveling for a death in the family. The report named the loophole exactly. The conditions of carriage let a station refuse transport pending review, and no policy anywhere required a station to document why the review had been opened. Marcus had approved that language himself in 2019 on his legal team's recommendation to shield the company from liability. He read that page 4 times, then wrote a single line in the margin, that the failure originated with him. The changes rolled out in October. A review could no longer be opened by a station manager without a written reason logged the moment it opened, plus a countersignature from a second station. A confirmed passenger could not be involuntarily bumped to accommodate another passenger's seat request under any circumstance. No exceptions for elite tiers, corporate accounts, or code switch partners. Every override would appear on a monthly report sent to the board and to frontline staff at every station. Gordon Reese wasn't fired for what he'd done to Marcus Whitfield. He was fired for 9 separate instances over the preceding 2 years where he'd used the same code against passengers whose names no one would ever know, and the termination letter said so explicitly because Marcus insisted the reason be stated plainly. Denise Carlton was demoted and required to complete retraining. She kept the job she didn't expect to keep. Walter Simmons stayed on as station director. He'd done the right thing within 4 minutes of learning the facts, and Marcus told him 4 minutes was a good number, that the real problem had never been those 4 minutes. Sarah Mitchell was promoted twice within 8 months, first into a supervisory role in Omaha, then into a position Diane Foster created at Marcus's direction, compliance lead, a job whose entire purpose was holding the authority to tell a shift manager no. Sarah opened a record on a Wednesday evening because a passenger asked her to, and it cost her nothing and changed everything. Marcus told her, shaking her hand, that the company was saved by one person doing the ordinary thing at the ordinary moment. Robert Hale and Nina Castillo each received letters for their files stating they'd exercised independent command authority correctly under pressure. Marcus wrote both letters himself and signed them not as owner, but as a passenger.
Diana Sinclair wasn't sued, and she wasn't banned. In late September, she published a signed statement under her own name and read it aloud in a conference room in Omaha to 14 people, most of whom she'd never met, including Sarah Mitchell, Denise Carlton, and a woman from the Skyline call center who'd taken 3 of the calls that night. She laid out exactly what she'd done at Gate 14 without softening any of it. She said she'd used money first and relationships second, that both had worked immediately, and the speed of it was the thing she couldn't stop thinking about. Then she went further than required. She'd spent the summer combing her own firm's records and found 9 occasions across 4 years where her office had made the same kind of request at an airport counter. She read those aloud too, admitted she hadn't known about 6 of them, and that not knowing had been the arrangement all along. She made restitution to every passenger who could be identified and stepped down from her firm's board. Marcus sat in the room and said nothing while she spoke, and afterward told her only that the statement had been enough, which was neither forgiveness nor its refusal, and she seemed to understand the difference. The fund launched in November, called Wings Home. It did one thing. When someone needed to reach a dying relative or a funeral and couldn't afford the fare or find a seat, the fund paid for the ticket, and more importantly, held a small number of protected seats on every Meridian flight that couldn't be sold, released, or reviewed away by anyone at any station for any reason. Marcus insisted on that second part more than the first. Money, he said, was the easy half. The hard half was making sure that when a person with no leverage stood at a counter at 6 in the evening, the seat behind them couldn't be taken from under them. The fund moved 4,200 people in its first year. Marcus never once showed up at an event for it. He went back to the house at the edge of Omaha, with its gravel drive and leaning mailbox, and fixed neither. He still bought his coffee at the gas station on Dodge Street, and the clerk still believed he worked in insurance, and he still never corrected her. He'd built the anonymity originally to learn how the world treated a man who looked like nobody. He kept it afterward because he'd gotten his answer, and the only useful thing left to do with an answer like that was spend the rest of his working life making sure it came out differently for the next person standing at that counter. He'd held every form of power a man could hold, and on the one night it mattered most, none of it moved a single aircraft an inch. What moved things was a gate agent who opened a record she wasn't required to open, a pastor who held a graveside a few extra minutes, a captain who'd buried his own father alone and waited 17 years to make sure someone else wouldn't have to. Money opens doors. It opened every door in that terminal in 14 minutes. But decency, integrity, and the plain refusal to treat another person as an obstacle are the only things that make a man worth the doors he walks through. Never measure a person by what they appear to be. The quiet one standing in front of you in the worn jacket, asking for nothing but what he's owed, may be carrying more than you could ever imagine, and the proof of who he is will be that he never once has to tell you.